双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Essays, Political, Economical and Philosophical. Volume 1. By Benjamin Rumford. Contents. Dedication. First essay. An account of an establishment for the poor at Munich. Second essay. On the fundamental principles on which general establishments for the relief of the poor may be formed in all countries. Third essay. Of food and particularly of feeding the poor. Fourth essay. Of chimney fireplaces with proposals for improving them to save fuel, to render dwelling houses more comfortable and salubrious, and effectually to prevent chimneys from smoking. Fifth essay. A short account of several public institutions lately formed in Bavaria, together with the appendix to the first volume. Dedication. To His Most Serene Highness the Elector Palatine Reigning Duke of Bavaria, etc., etc., etc. Sir, in requesting permission to dedicate to you Most Serene Electoral Highness these essays, I had several important objects in view. I was desirous of showing to the world that I had not presumed to publish an account of public measures and institutions, planned and executed in your Electoral Highness's dominions, by your orders, and under your immediate authority and protection, without your leave and approbation. I was also desirous of availing myself of the illustrious name of a sovereign eminently distinguished by his munificence in promoting useful knowledge, and by his solicitude for the happiness and prosperity of his subjects, to recommend the important objects I have undertaken to investigate, to the attention of the great, the wise, and the benevolent. And lastly, I was anxious to have an opportunity of testifying, in a public manner, my gratitude to your Most Serene Electoral Highness for all your kindness to me, and more especially for the distinguished honor you have done me by selecting and employing me as an instrument in your hands of doing good. I have the honor to be, with the most profound respect, and with unalterable attachment, Sir, your Most Serene Electoral Highness's devoted servant, Rumford, London, July 1 St. 1796. Contents of Essay I. An account of an establishment for the poor at Munich, together with a detail of various public measures connected with that institution, which have been adopted and carried into effect for putting an end to mendicity and introducing order and useful industry among the more indigent of the inhabitants of Bavaria. Introduction. Chapter I. Of the prevalence of mendicity in Bavaria at the time when the measures for putting an end to it were adopted. Chapter 2. Various preparations made for putting an end to mendicity in Bavaria. Cantonment of the cavalry in the country towns and villages. Formation of the committee placed at the head of the institution for the poor at Munich. The funds of that institution. Chapter 3. Preparations made for giving employment to the poor. Difficulties attending that undertaking. The measures adopted completely successful. The poor reclaimed to habits of useful industry. Description of the House of Industry at Munich. Chapter 4. An account of the taking up of the beggars at Munich. The inhabitants are called upon for their assistance. General subscription for the relief and support of the poor. All other public and private collections for the poor abolished. Chapter V. The different kinds of employment given to the beggars upon their being assembled in the House of Industry. Their great awkwardness at first. Their docility, and their progress in useful industry. The manner in which they were treated. The manner in which they were fed. The precautions used to prevent abuses in the public kitchen from which they were fed. Chapter 6. Apology for the want of method in treating the subject under consideration. Of the various means used for encouraging industry among the poor. Of the internal arrangement and government of the House of Industry. Why called the military workhouse. Of the manner in which the business is carried on there. Of the various means used for preventing frauds in carrying on the business in the different manufactures. Of the flourishing state of those manufactures. Chapter 7. A further account of the poor, who were brought together in the House of Industry. and of the interesting change which was produced in their manners and dispositions. Various proofs that the means used for making them industrious, comfortable, and happy were successful. Chapter 8. Of the means used for the relief of those poor persons who were not beggars. Of the large sums of money distributed to the poor in alms. Of the means used for rendering those who received alms industrious. Of the general utility of the house of industry to the poor, and the distressed of all denominations. Of public kitchens for feeding the poor, united with establishments for giving them employment, and of the great advantages which would be derived from forming them in every parish. Of the manner in which the poor of Munich are lodged. Chapter 9. Of the means used for extending the influence of the institution for the poor at Munich to other parts of Bavaria. Of the progress which some of the improvements introduced at Munich are making in other countries. Introduction. Situation of the author in the service of His Most Serene Highness the Elector Palatine, reigning Duke of Bavaria. Reasons which induced him to undertake to form an establishment for the relief of the poor. Among the vicissitudes of a life checkered by a great variety of incidents, and in which I have been called upon to act in many interesting scenes, I have had an opportunity of employing my attention upon a subject of great importance, a subject intimately and inseparably connected with the happiness and well-being of all civil societies, and which, from its nature, cannot fail to interest every benevolent mind. It is the providing for the wants of the poor, and the securing their happiness and comfort by the introduction of order and industry among them. The subject, though it is so highly interesting to mankind, has not yet been investigated with that success that could have been wished. This fact is apparent, not only from the prevalence of indolence, misery, and beggary in almost all the countries of Europe, but also from the great variety of opinion among those who have taken the matter into serious consideration, and have proposed methods for remedying those evils, so generally and so justly complained of. What I have to offer upon this subject being not merely speculative opinion, but the genuine result of actual experiments, of experiments made upon a very large scale, and under circumstances which render them peculiarly interesting, I cannot help flattering myself that my readers will find both amusement and useful information from the perusal of the following sheets. As it may perhaps appear extraordinary that a military man should undertake a work so foreign to his profession as that of forming and executing a plan for providing for the poor, I have thought it not improper to preface the narrative of my operations by a short account of the motives which induced me to engage in this undertaking. And in order to throw still more light upon the whole transaction, I shall begin with a few words of myself, of my situation in the country in which I reside, and of the different objects which were had in view in the various public measures in which I have been concerned. This information is necessary in order to form a clear idea of the circumstances under which the operations in question were undertaken, and the different public measures which were adopted at the same time. Having in the year 1784, with His Majesty's gracious permission, engaged myself in the service of His Most Serene Highness the Elector Palatine, reigning Duke of Bavaria, I have since been employed by His Electoral Highness in various public services, and particularly in arranging his military affairs, and introducing a new system of order, discipline, and economy among his troops. In the execution of this commission, ever mindful of that great and important truth, that no political arrangement can be really good, except in so far as it contributes to the general good of society, I have endeavored in all my operations to unite the interest of the soldier with the interest of civil society, and to render the military force, even in time of peace, subservient to the public good, to facilitate and promote these important objects, to establish a respectable standing military force, which should do the least possible harm to the population, morals, manufactures, and agriculture of the country. It was necessary to make soldiers citizens, and citizens soldiers. To this end the situation of the soldier was made as easy, comfortable, and eligible as possible. His pay was increased. He was comfortably and even elegantly clothed, and he was allowed every kind of liberty not inconsistent with good order and due subordination. His military exercises were simplified, his instruction rendered short and easy, and all obsolete and useless customs and usages were banished from the service. Great attention was paid to the external appearance of the buildings, and nothing was left undone that could tend to make the men comfortable in their dwellings. Schools were established in all the regiments for arithmetic, and into these schools, not only the soldiers and their children, but also the children of the neighboring citizens and peasants, were admitted gratis, and even school books, paper, pens, and ink were furnished for them at the expense of the sovereign. Besides these schools of instruction, others, called schools of industry, were established in the regiments, where the soldiers and their children were taught various kinds of work, and from whence they were supplied with raw materials to work for their own emolument, as nothing is so certain fatal to morals, and particularly to the morals of the lower class of mankind, as habitual idleness. Every possible measure was adopted that could be devised to introduce a spirit of industry among the troops. Every encouragement was given to the soldiers to employ their leisure time, when they were off duty, in working for their own emolument, and, among other encouragements, the most efficacious of all, that of allowing them full liberty to dispose of the money acquired by their labor in any way they should think proper, without being obliged to give any account of it to anybody. They were even furnished with working dresses, a canvas frock and trousers, gratis, at their enlisting, and were afterwards permitted to retain their old uniforms for the same purpose. And care was taken, in all cases where they were employed, that they should be well paid. They commonly received from 16 to 18 kreuzers, 2 a day for their labor, and with this they had the advantage of being clothed and lodged, and, in many cases, of receiving their full pay of 5 kreuzers, and £1.50, 1 pound, 13.5 ounce, avoirdupois, of bread per day from the sovereign, when they did their duty in their regiments, by mounting guard regularly according to their tour, which commonly was every 4th day, and only worked those days they happened to be off guard. In that case, they received their full pay. But when they were excused from regimental duty, and permitted to work every day for their own emolument, their pay, at 5 kreuzers per day, was stopped. But they were still permitted to receive their bread, and to lodge in the barracks. In all public works, such as making and repairing highways, draining marshes, repairing the banks of rivers, etc., soldiers were employed as laborers, and in all such cases, the greatest care was taken to provide for their comfortable subsistence, and even for their amusement. Good lodgings were prepared for them, and good and wholesome food, at a reasonable price, and the greatest care was taken of them when they happened to fall sick. Frequently, when considerable numbers of them were at work together, a band of music was ordered to play to them while at work, and on holidays they were permitted, and even encouraged, to make merry, with dancing and other innocent sports and amusements, to preserve good order and harmony among those who were detached upon these working parties. A certain proportion of officers and non-commissioned officers were always sent with them, and those commonly served as overseers of the works, and as such were paid. Besides this permission to work for hire in the garrison towns, and upon detached working parties, which was readily granted to all those who desired it, or at least to as many as could possibly be spared from the necessary service of the garrison, every facility and encouragement was given to the soldier who was a native of the country, and who had a family of friends to go to, or private concerns to take care of, to go home on furlough, and to remain absent from his regiment from one annual exercise to the other, that is to say, 10 months and a half each year. This arrangement was very advantageous to the agriculture and manufactures, and even to the population of the country, for the soldiers were allowed to marry, and served not a little to the establishment of harmony and a friendly intercourse between the soldiers and the peasantry. and to facilitate recruiting. Another measure which tended much to render the situation of the soldier pleasant and agreeable, and to facilitate the recruiting service, was the rendering the garrisons of the regiments permanent. This measure might not be advisable in a despotic or odious government, for where the authority of the sovereign must be supported by the terror of arms, all habits of social intercourse and friendship between the soldiers and the subjects must be dangerous. But in all well-regulated governments, such friendly intercourse is attended with many advantages. A peasant would more readily consent to his son's engaging himself to serve as a soldier in a regiment permanently stationed in his neighborhood, than in one at a great distance, or whose destination was uncertain. And when the station of a regiment is permanent, and it receives its recruits from the district of country immediately surrounding its headquarters, the men who go home on furlough have but a short journey to make, and are easily assembled in case of any emergency. And it was the more necessary to give every facility to the soldiers to go home on furlough in Bavaria, as laborers are so very scarce in that country that the husbandman would not be able, without them, to cultivate his ground. The habits of industry and of order which the soldier acquired when in garrison rendered him so much the more useful as a laborer when on furlough. But not contented with merely furnishing labors for the assistance of the husbandman, I was desirous of making use of the army as a means of introducing useful improvements into the country. Though agriculture is carried to the highest perfection in some parts of the elector's dominions, yet in others, and particularly in Bavaria, it is still much behindhand. Very few of the new improvements in that art, such as the introduction of new and useful plants, the cultivation of clover, and of turnips, the regular succession of crops, etc., have yet found their way into general practice in that country. And even the potato, that most useful of all the products of the ground, is scarcely known there. It was principally with a view to introduce the culture of potatoes in that country that the military gardens were formed. These gardens, of which there is one in every garrison belonging to the elector's dominion, Dusseldorf and Amberg only excepted 3, are pieces of ground, or adjoining to the garrison towns, which are regularly laid out, and exclusively appropriated to the use of the non-commissioned officers and private soldiers belonging to the regiments in garrison. The ground is regularly divided into districts of regiments, battalions, companies, and corporalities, corporal shafts, of which last divisions there are 4 to each company, and the quantity of ground allotted to each corporality is such that each man belonging to it, whether non-commissioned officer or private, has a bed 365 square feet in superficies. This piece of ground remains his sole property as long as he continues to serve in the regiment, and he is at full liberty to cultivate it in any way, and to dispose of the produce of it in any manner he may think proper. He must, however, cultivate it, and plan it, and keep it neat and free from weeds. Otherwise, if he should be idle, and neglect it, it would be taken from him and given to one of his more industrious comrades. The divisions of these military gardens are marked by broader and smaller alleys, covered with gravel, and neatly kept, and in order that every one who chooses it may be a spectator of this interesting scene of industry. All the principal alleys, which are made large for that purpose, are always open as a public walk. The effect which this establishment has already produced in the short time, little more than 5 years since it was begun, is very striking, and much greater and more important than I could have expected. The soldiers, from being the most indolent of mortals, and from having very little knowledge of gardening, or of the produce of a garden, for use, are now becoming industrious and skillful cultivators, and they are grown so fond of vegetables, particularly of potatoes, which they raise in great quantities, that these useful and wholesome productions now constitutes a very essential part of their daily food. And these improvements are also spreading very fast among the farmers and peasants throughout the whole country. There's hardly a soldier that goes on furlough, or that returns home at the expiration of his time of service, that does not carry with him a few potatoes for planting, and a little collection of garden seeds, And I have no doubt, but in a very few years we shall see potatoes as much cultivated in Bavaria as in other countries, and that the use of vegetables for food will be generally introduced among the common people. I have already had the satisfaction to see little gardens here and there making their appearance in different parts of the country, and I hope that very soon no farmer's house will be found without one. To assist the soldiers in the cultivation of their gardens, they are furnished with garden utensils gratis. They are likewise furnished from time to time with a certain quantity of manure, and with an assortment of garden feeds. But they do not rely solely upon these supplies. Those who are industrious collect materials in their barracks and in the streets for making manure, and even sometimes purchase it, and they raise in their own gardens most of the garden seeds they stand in need of, to enable them to avail themselves of their gardens as early in the spring as possible, in supplying their tables with green vegetables. Each company is furnished with a hotbed for raising early plants, to attach the soldiers more strongly to these their little possessions, by increasing their comfort and convenience in the cultivation and enjoyment of them. A number of little summer houses, or rather huts, one to each company, have been erected for the purpose of shelter, where they can retire when it rains, or when they are fatigued. All the officers of the regiments, from the highest to the lowest, are ordered to give the men every assistance in the cultivation of these their gardens. But they are forbidden, upon pain of the severest punishment, to appropriate to themselves any part of the produce of them, or even to receive any part of it in presents. Chapter I. Of the prevalence of mendicity in Bavaria at the time when the measures for putting an end to it were adopted. Among the various measures that occurred to me by which the military establishment of the country might be made subservient to the public good in time of peace, none appeared to be of so much importance as that of employing the army in clearing the country of beggars, thieves, and other vagabonds, and in watching over the public tranquillity. But in order to clear the country of beggars, the number of whom in Bavaria had become quite intolerable, it was necessary to adopt general and efficacious measures for maintaining and supporting the poor. Laws were not wanting to oblige each community in the country to provide for its own poor, but these laws had been so long neglected, and beggary had become so general, that extraordinary measures, and the most indefatigable exertions, were necessary to put a stop to this evil. The number of itinerant beggars, of both sexes, and all ages, as well foreigners as natives, who strolled about the country in all directions, levying contributions from the industrious inhabitants, stealing and robbing, and leading a life of indolence, and the most shameless debauchery, was quite incredible. And so numerous were the swarms of beggars in all the great towns, and particularly in the capital, so great their impudence, and so persevering their importunity, that it was almost impossible to cross the streets without being attacked, and absolutely forced to satisfy their clamorous demands. And these beggars were in general by no means such as from age or bodily infirmities were unable by their labor to earn their livelihood, but they were for the most part stout, strong, healthy, sturdy beggars, who, lost to every sense of shame, had embraced the profession from choice, not necessity, and who, not unfrequently, added insolence and threats to their importunity, and extorted that from fear, which they could not procure by their arts of dissimulation. These beggars not only infested all the streets, public walks, and public places, but they even made a practice of going into private houses, where they never failed to steal whatever fell in their way. If they found the doors open, and nobody at home, and the churches were so full of them that it was quite a nuisance, and a public scandal during the performance of divine service. People at their devotions were continually interrupted by them, and were frequently obliged to satisfy their demands in order to be permitted to finish their prayers in peace and quiet. In short, these detestable vermin swarmed everywhere, and not only their impudence and clamorous importunity were without any bounds, but they had recourse to the most diabolical arts, and most horrid crimes, in the prosecution of their infamous trade. Young children were stolen from their parents by these wretches, and their eyes put out, or their tender limbs broken and distorted, in order, by exposing them thus maimed, to excite the pity and commiseration of the public. And every species of artifice was made use of to agitate the sensibility, and to extort the contributions of the humane and charitable. Some of these monsters were so void of all feeling as to expose even their own children, naked, and almost starved, in the streets, in order that, by their cries and unaffected expressions of distress, they might move those who passed by to pity and relieve them, and in order to make them act their part more naturally, they were unmercifully beaten when they came home,